know that any institutional approach to something like working integrated learning is about the people. And for PACE, it's a distributed model. It's not just the PACE team in the centre, but it's all of our colleagues in faculty who work really hard to ensure that the PACE initiative really has the legs. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tanya Evans, who is a historian in the Faculty of Arts. I'll read some of the blurb. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Modern History, where she teaches Australian and Public History, and is the director of the Centre for Applied History. Importantly, Tanya is here as the convener of a PACE unit, and as well as being the author of several books in the field and a noted public historian, she's going to tell us about how the PACE program has impacted her students, both at uni and beyond uni. So Tanya, welcome.
Hello everyone. It's wonderful being here, partly because I love talking about PACE. PACE is where I get to practice what I preach as a scholar, as a teacher, and as someone who is very passionate about engaging with the community. So PACE brings together all of that for me really well, and I'm currently teaching PACE at the moment. I'll go straight from here to meet my PACE students to work on an exhibition this afternoon, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So as Sherman said, I teach Australian history, and I also teach public history. So public history is the representation of history outside of academia. So I curate exhibitions, I produce history on television, in radio, and I try to write for general as well as scholarly readers. And I try to teach my students some of those skills and the importance of engaging with the broader community. Now, every information day, every open day, at my son's high school's careers advice session last week, I kept being asked, what job can I possibly get with a history degree? What job can I possibly get with an arts degree? These are people, young kids, you know, year 9, 10, 11, 12, passionate about history, but like, I don't want to be a history teacher, but I want to think about ways in which I can develop my disciplinary knowledge, my knowledge of history. And I say, well, look, the people I graduated with, who did the same degree as I did as an undergraduate in history and politics, they work in a huge range of fields. There are management consultants, there are politicians, there's journalists, there are people who work for the BBC. I came from Britain. So they work in a huge range of fields. And I think it's very important that we teach our students that they can study history, they can study an arts degree, but they can go into business, they can go into commerce, they can go into a whole heap of organisations. But what I want is, I know they won't go on to probably work in the history field, but I want them to keep their love and passion for the subject of history throughout their very long lives. And I'll show you some of the ways in which I hope to be doing that in the way in which I undertake my teaching. So I'm also president of the History Council of New South Wales, which is the peak body in the state that represents historical organisations and people passionate about history. And you'll see some of the ways in which I use that role in the way in which I teach and research as well. So as I've suggested, I'm very keen on setting my students on a path towards employability. I want them to recognise the diverse skills that they have acquired throughout their degree. So I want them to recognise their oral and written communication skills. I want them to learn how to best promote themselves and the work that they have undertaken, and to think about the ways in which they might contribute to the community around them. So I'm very keen on promoting active citizenship amongst my students as well. And one of the ways in which I do that is to curate a variety of history internships for my students. So my students have undertaken projects for the Australian Paralympic History Project based in Homebush, not far from here, writing Wikipedia articles. So we bemoan the fact that our students get all of their research from Wikipedia, and this is one way in which they can work out how those Wikipedia articles are constructed and what forms and uses they can have. I've also got students working in diverse forms of school histories as well. So I've got Scots College involved, and Kincoppel Rose Bay are also keen on recording their history in diverse forms. And I've got one current student who's doing some brilliant work with Erskineville Public School, who are very keen on memorialising their history at the moment. I've also got students working with the Sydney Pride History Group, working on collecting and sorting through oral histories that have that represent the lives of gay and lesbian Australians today. I've also got lots and lots of my students getting hands-on experience at the Australian History Museum here on campus. And at the moment, they're very busy because we're engaged in this huge decant project because we're being moved out of our building in W6A. And those students are engaged on that decant project, so working through objects. And the wonderful thing about being involved with the Australian History Museum, unlike going to the British Museum or the Australian Museum in the city, is that they get lots of hands-on experience. And for students, that's crucial. They get to handle objects and use objects and think about objects very differently than they might in other circumstances. But I also have my students working as interns for the History Council of New South Wales, and one not so very far away from me who'll be talking about some of her experiences in a moment. But one of the key projects that we're working on with the History Council is something called Speaker Connect, which is trying to create conversations with history and community organisations across rural and regional New South Wales. And I know from my experience that a lot of my students, they live at home, they haven't travelled independently very far, they're more likely to have perhaps gone to Bali with their families than they have gone to Burke, for example. So what I'm trying to do is to get my students to engage with rural and regional communities, to take themselves out of their comfort zones, to transform their learning and their understanding of themselves in significant ways. So, not so far from home, my last project was a book, a history of my local swimming club, which I got my PACE students and my Masters of Research students in public history to be engaged with. And one of the joys of PACE is that I get to teach history down at the beach rather than here at Macquarie. That involves students working with diverse historical materials, producing research in different ways, thinking about how to reach different audiences with what might seem like a terribly parochial history of a swimming club on the lower North Shore of Sydney. But actually, I was trying to make a much bigger statement about Australian history and about the kind of meanings of swimming in people's lives, both nationally and internationally. And the lovely Geraldine Doog emphasised at the book's launch down at Balmoral Beach that this, might seem like a parochial history of a local swimming club, but it was much more than that. It was about a history on how, we can't see that, a guide on how to be a good citizen is what she said at the launch. What I wanted to do with that book is to make clear, make visible all the sorts of invisible labour that is undertaken in our communities. And I wanted to kind of promote that to people, not just on the lower North Shore of Sydney, and to you guys, please do go out and buy the book, but also internationally as well. So, I've been undertaking research on the experiences of my PACE students. At the very start, when PACE was introduced, I had my students undertake modern history internships as part of the Faculty of Arts PACE unit. I wanted to spend a few years carefully curating projects because I thought that would lead to particularly meaningful outcomes, both for the students, for partners, but also actually for the broader discipline as well as for communities. And I've been gathering survey data and interview data with students who've participated in modern history PACE units since 2012. And it's revealed that, students have understood through PACE what their skills are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what sorts of jobs they might like to do in the future, what sorts of jobs they may not very well want to do in the future. And for some, it has resulted in paid employment, but it's also given them a much greater awareness of what they want to do beyond university. And Stephanie will talk more about that in her own experience in a moment. But for many of them, it did turn their university experience around. It made them realise the relevance of history learning and teaching and what the broader community might learn through history. But it also made them, very much more conscious of the oral and written communication skills that they had fostered throughout their degree. Another student worked curating an exhibition on Vietnamese migration within the Australian History Museum. And this was a student, again, who was not, was actually an adorable student. And PACE really, I saw him blossom beautifully during PACE. He really developed a lot of his social skills and his networking skills during this process. I just had a week on networking in my current PACE unit a couple of weeks ago. And again, I get my students to reflect on a weekly basis, what they're learning each week to week. And they said, goodness me, I'd never thought about networking in these terms. And for me, I am trying to challenge those old boys networks, those networks that bankers and others can access if they've kind of come through a particular elite schooling system system. I want to develop other sorts of networks and to kind of encourage students to think about how to increase their skills, to figure out how they do negotiate big crowds of people who they've never met before. And it's clear to me that PACE does that, for my students anyway. And so for this particular student, he was a trainee teacher. A lot of students studying history are also undertaking education degrees. So he was set on his path towards education. But this process of curating the exhibition taught him how much he loved working with museums and objects. And he may well still go on to be a teacher, but it does mean that this process has allowed him to think about the different ways of presenting and representing historical knowledge and how to get his students engaged in that process as well. But what it was wonderful, I think, is that he said it got him out the house. It got him thinking about how he might participate in his community more broadly. You know, he didn't have to sit at home watching television. He could actually spend his time much more productively engaged with other people and in broader groups of people as well. So that's something that I took great delight in learning. And all of these PACE students have said, you know, that PACE did take them out of their comfort zones. It got them mixing with people that they hadn't ordinarily mixed with and got them thinking about those different ways in which they might negotiate those different environments, which I think is enormously beneficial, particularly if you're still living at home, you're still going to university with the people you largely went to school with, and you don't travel terribly much. So I think this is really important, and that's why those students need to go to Berk rather than Bali. So my current project, coming off this book, this history of my local swimming club, I've got two PACE students, an MRes student, and actually an intern from the University of Sydney, because she never had opportunities like this presented to her at Sydney, so she's come to me actually after we had a symposium on employability at the History Council. So she's coming to work with us on producing this exhibition, which will open next week. You're all very welcome to come to it at Mossman Library. And I was there till late last night. Anybody who's curated an exhibition will know that it's always hard yards at the end, and there's all sorts of late nights and panel text writing to take place. And I was there with the lovely Wai Lan, who is an international student from Hong Kong. He's my very first student who's doing a double degree in arts and commerce. We need more of these students. I adore him. He was busy working on a beautifully constructed timeline for the exhibition that's going to go in a beautiful panel. He's got creative skills I haven't remotely got myself, and I was helping to kind of produce some historical information for this timeline. And he was talking to me about how, yes, he was probably going to end up in a job with in commerce, but he was telling me also how much this process of working on this project had completely transformed his understanding of history and the community, and what you might be able to do on an everyday basis in your community. So I'm sort of confident, I'm a glasses half full kind of girl, but I'm sort of confident when Wai Lan is on his 13th job in his mid-40s, he will go, you know, that bank, you know, I've had enough, I've done my, you know, my 50, 60 hours a week. Now's the time to focus on my real passion, my history. And he'll come back to the history profession, because that's what my disciplinary research tells me. I work with family history and local history, and I see the people who've retired from banking and commerce, and they're deeply passionate about family history and lifelong learning. So I'm confident that Wai Lan will come back to the history fold in time, even though he might get a really proper job in commerce in the process. So I'm looking very forward to constructing future community history projects like this throughout rural and regional New South Wales. And I'm intent on that at the moment. I've also got lots of international networks as well. I research in Britain and in Canada, and I'm keen to develop my students' capacity to undertake internships in public history contexts in those different geographical national contexts. But I don't want my students to forget the local. I think the local is really, really important. And I want them to be thinking about how they might make contributions to their communities in lots of different ways. Yes, in their employed lives, but also in their other lives, their private lives, those invisible lives that don't always get recorded by statisticians or historians or others. And I think it's important that we always keep an eye on the history on our doorstep and everything else on our doorstep in that process. Thank you.